It's a weirdly pervasive myth in Hellenist circles that magic was exclusively seen as negative and hated in ancient times. Considered hubris even, when nothing's further from the truth. We have thousands upon thousands of curse tablets, binding spells, and the apotropaic items used to protect from them, as well as from disease, bad luck, the evil eye, and a host of other negative things. So let's take a look at how the ancients protected and healed themselves spiritually. Karate. I want to get a quick disclaimer out of the way. I'm going to be speaking about the healing rites and healing spells a bit in this one, and even though I've said this many times in the past, someone out there is going to try to clip me out of context and claim I'm endorsing the ancient methods of healing as being somehow superior or a replacement for modern science just because I mentioned them. I am not. Simple as that. Healing rites and prayers and the like can be used alongside modern medicine, but they're not a replacement. The gods gave us the gift of reason for a reason. Science is also a blessing. As a methodology, it's allowed us to extend our lifespans, treat problems that were once incurable, and improve the quality of life for millions who may have died in childhood in antiquity. If you're sick, go to the dang doctor, okay? In ancient times, if you got an infection in a wound, what antibiotics can take care of in a few hours could kill you in a matter of days. So go to the doctor. Okay? Got it? If you're dealing with harassment or other real-world issues, talk to the authorities and lawyers alongside prayers and magic. Even in ancient times, the gods take care of those who act for themselves. Okay. Disclaimer over, let's get into what this video is about. The ancient world was a pretty terrifying place. Imagine giving birth without modern medicine, or having to deal with infections without antibiotics, which, as I just covered, could kill you in just a few days, or farming without pesticides and herbicides. Human life was at the whim of nature, and the gods more often than not, and though some effective ancient remedies existed for these things, most ancient medicine looked a lot more like modern occultism than modern science. When all else failed and prayers seemed to go unanswered the traditional way, the ancients turned to magic, and many modern folks do as well, to augment things that they're doing in their daily lives, to try and get that extra bump, if you will. Some also see magic as a devotional activity for patron deities who have an affinity for it, and my hope is that the work here can help you get started on looking into ancient methods as you build your own practice. So this video will be divided into 3 parts. The first will cover methodologies for magic and how we know about some of them. In part 2, we'll take a look at amulets and spells used for healing with a focus on those with written inscriptions, as these are the ones we can for sure determine the use for. Part 3 will cover phylakteries or protective amulets, their various uses, and some of the formulae that we have surviving for them. This video is meant to be more of an overview and by no means comprehensive, so my sources will be listed in the description as always so you can dig deeper into the topics if you want to. While you're down there, maybe subscribe and give the poor neglected like some love. If you'd like to help me afford the downright disgusting prices for the scholarly materials I use and the monthly extortion for my editing software and the stock footage site and Leb and JSTOR and all the other repositories that I have to pay for the materials that I use for these videos, links are also down there to my Patreon, or for one-time donations, Ko-Fi. Patrons get access to videos a little bit early, that's the main benefit you get, and there's a special chat in my Discord where you can suggest topics and other things. I talk to patrons pretty regularly. No pressure if your finances aren't in the best shape though. Watching the vid all the way through, subscribing, commenting, and liking will all help push the video in the algorithm so more folks will see it. With that, let's get into it. Part 1. Methodology. Evidence for magic goes all the way back in written sources. Ancient Greek magic isn't solely syncretic as some in the community would like to claim. Myself included at one point, actually. Before I did all my research for my original magic video, I believed some of these myths. It's kind of some of the first information the community gets exposed to. In Odyssey 19:455-8, which may date all the way back to the Bronze Age, we're told that Odysseus was wounded by a boar while out hunting when Homer stops to mention a significant scar on his body. Then, the dear sons of Autoclus busied themselves with the carcass, and the wound of noble, godlike Odysseus they bound skillfully, and checked the black blood with an incantation, and straightway returned to the house of their dear father. We see multiple ingredients here. The intuitive binding of the wound itself, plus the spoken charm, which is given credit for the blood clotting rather than the binding itself. We'll get into the incantation spoken for protection and healing more in the next few sections, but for now, it's clear that ancient Greek medicine often contained charms and prayers included specifically to request divine intervention, or to make use of the natural properties of materials believed to otherwise potentially be inaccessible. This is the first recorded act of magic in the Greek tradition, all the way back in the Bronze Age. Magic has been in Greece for a long time. In fact, to modern eyes, many things that were just considered normal practice look like magic. Hesiod laments contradictory information on herbal remedies and proper agricultural timing in works and days, indicating some level of herbal lore was common knowledge among farmers at this time. Pindar tells us that Asclepios used a combination of herbs, potions, incantations, and surgery for treatment in his Pythian Ode 3, which shows that during his time at least, a combination of different treatments were considered normal medical practice. However, there was also a feud in written texts between doctors of the Hippocratic schools and what they saw as hucksters and charlatans edging in on their business with supposedly phony magic charms, formulae, incantations, and amulets. In the work Sacred Disease, dated back to the 4th or 5th century BCE, we get one of our earliest rants to this effect, in which Hippocrates himself lambasts those who believe epilepsy is a divine disease which requires purification charms and potions to dispose of. I think the first people who have characterized epilepsy as sacred are those who are in our own day magoi, purifiers, kathartoi, mendicant priests, and charlatans. These people pretend to be very reverent of the gods and to have superior knowledge. They hide behind the idea of the divine and disguise the fact that they have nothing with which to fight the disease and bring relief. To make sure their ignorance does not become evidence, they spread the belief that this disease is sacred. They add a plausible story to make their method of healing safe, and as far as they are concerned, they use purifications and incantations and tell people to refrain from bathing and from eating many foods inappropriate for the sick. Well, he goes into some more detail about specific recommendations here, but I'm going to skip forward a bit to where he gets more into the salt. These rules they impose due to their sacred nature of the disease, as if they had superior knowledge. They talk of other causes too, so that they may become famous for their skill and if the patient recovers. And if he dies, they always have a good excuse, because they are not at all to blame, but the gods. Since they have not given the patient a drug to eat or to drink, and since they have not ordered baths, they cannot be held responsible. It's interesting that he later goes on to give similar recommendations to the ones that he lambasts here, though for the rest of the much longer quote accuses these magicians of impiety because they claim to be able to demand of the gods and claim that the gods themselves inflict disease using a range of different symptoms epileptic patients could demonstrate during seizures to diagnose which god may be causing the problem. In a sick burn later, he entreats the magicians to take the refuse they cleansed out of the patient to the temple where it supposedly originated from, which if you know anything about the way the ancients viewed bodily fluids, miasma, and the divine, is a pretty gross challenge. The theology of the argument is beyond the scope of this video, but the point that is being made here is that the line between ancient science, theology, and magic looked pretty blurry to the average person. And the service of magicians were clearly popular enough that even during the classical era, the author felt the need to tell the population off for employing them. Which reminds me, a note on my methodology and sourcing for this particular video. A lot of the evidence for apotropaic magic specifically, i.e. things that are not curse tablets, containing inscriptions or formulae we can use to determine the use for these spells, comes from the Hellenistic period as quotes and the Roman period and later as actual systematized collections, when writing became much more prevalent for spells. I know I typically focus on the classical and archaic era in my work, however, it's much easier to contextualize and discuss objects with writing on them, or which are described in writings that survive, so for this one I'm gonna need to lean more heavily on later material. Also, PGM is the typical acronym for the Greek Magical Papyri, a loosely affiliated collection of magical texts found in Egypt and in various locations around the Roman Empire. Though they're often grouped together, these texts are typically standalone documents that simply draw on similar themes rather than being written to go together, the way that they're often viewed in translations available to modern people. In other words, they're a bunch of individual spell and recipe books and fragments that all got stuck together in a Frankenstein's monster type scenario, rather than specifically a single book. Either way, when I say PGM, I'm referring to the Greek Magical Papyri for the rest of this video. So, protective magic. The majority of the evidence that we have for protective magic comes in the form of amulets and phylakteries, as well as some spell formulae and books like the documents that make up the PGM. Amulet is, of course, a catch-all term for any object that's meant to be worn or carried close to the body, which contain protective or healing properties. And phylactery is a Greek word that denoted specifically protective objects. Amulets and phylacteries took many forms, from rings to pendants to small objects carried in leather pouches, such as rolled papyri or inscribed stones. Keeping the item close to the body was key to these protective properties. Both the material and imagery are essential when discussing physical objects and their magical properties, as seen by the ancient Greeks. Material could range from perishable items like papyrus, wax, animal parts, plants, to more permanent lead tablets, gemstones, stones, and precious metals. Though it's important to note that lead tablets were significantly less common for protective or healing magic and far more common for things like curse tablets. Probably because you would dispose of the lead curse tablets because, you wouldn't necessarily want to keep a curse near you. You'd want to put it somewhere where it could be put to use. Anyhow, many of these materials were thought to have special magical properties latent that could be activated with the formulaic incantations, which we'll get to in a little bit. Our record of the more perishable items comes primarily from collections of formulae and more systematized records from later antiquity, such as the so-called Orphica Liquica, Dioscorides' medical materials, Pliny's natural history, and the Chironides. These texts, alongside the PGM, also give us some idea of the meaning of earlier symbolism on more durable items, such as stone and gemstone amulets. Symbolism carved into or present on an amulet is as essential as the material the item was made from in determining what the amulet was meant to do. We'll go over individual symbols later in each section, but the symbolism is all we get along with the material for some of our earliest sources. Remember that a lot of these amulets represented a form of folk wisdom or folk magic, so sometimes the symbols or the preparation methods for individual items differed or seemingly contradicted one another. There were many different folk beliefs on what materials did what, especially in the classical era and earlier before the more systematic formulae became more widely available. So sometimes it can be tricky for historians to work backwards and figure out what amulets without inscriptions of text on them are all about. Magic systems can really be seemingly confusing and contradictory, and it's just the nature of the beast. If something a paper is talking about looks like it contradicts what a document says about a material or symbolism, it's probably because the creator was using a different system than the one described. There are also textual inscriptions on many later amulets, as well as itty-bitty inscriptions hidden in gems set in rings and necklaces. These inscriptions increase in complexity over time. Some of the most basic include entreaties to specific gods, such as Aestheos Serapis, or One God Serapis, along with brief prayers such as grant favor or protect the wearer from all harm. Even if the material was considered protective generally, the inscription was often considered significant in its specificity. Aristophanes' Just Man in Plutus ignores the threats of Carrion, a treacherous sycophant as phrased by the author of Magika Hiera, by replying that he has a ring that wards off such threats. Just Man, I fear you not, for I wear a ring that Eudamos sold me for a drachma. Carrion, but it is not marked for blackmail or bite. The comedic power in this passage comes from the implication that Carrion's threats carry no power because he's no better than the vermin whose bite the ring is supposed to ward off. And Carrion, utterly missing the point, replies that the ring's inscription doesn't actually cover him because he's a blackmailer and not vermin. Beautiful. Some nonsense words were also written as magical incantations, termed vocis magicae or nomina barbara, many of which were meant to mimic non-Greek languages, as they sounded to Greeks, to add further pleasing efficacy to the gods and the listeners. These words often have no translation in any language and were sometimes criticized by philosophers and priests alike because of this. Said inscriptions also sometimes included secret names of gods, a la the Egyptian tradition. We see this most often in the PGM, where a number of secret names are uttered as part of the incantation and declared to be special knowledge given to humanity in mythic times, to be so pleasing to the god in question they'll seemingly have no choice but to help the magician. The structure and phrasing of these incantations are often a source for the modern criticism that magic is hubris, as they appear to be commanding the gods rather than entreating them. It's important to recognize that prayers and incantations often match the traditional prayer structure with the secret names and commands, which to me look more often like, see, you said you really like these things, I'm doing them, so help me like you said you would, rather than being a dick to the gods. They replace the argument portion of the prayer, and amulets and specialized offerings such as dove fat replacing a whole dove sacrifice for a love charm, replacing traditional offerings. There's a syncretism here, but it's just that. Syncretism, not outright blasphemy, as some would seem to think. On the topic of the inscriptions, there was often magic power considered in the arrangement of letters. Palindromes, or words and sentences that read the same forward as backwards, were frequently found inscribed on gemstones. The most frequent was, well, I'm not even going to try to pronounce that, I'm just going to put it on the screen, which in Greek, the theta marked the center point, though in English isn't quite a palindrome. So the th there would be theta. Greek vowels were also frequently interpreted as symbols of the 7 planets of ancient astrology. They were arranged in specific ways and used as part of some magical formulae. That said, we can only speculate as to which vowels represented which planets, as nothing directly survives explaining the correspondences for us. At least according to a paper from the 50s that I cited in the description. I couldn't find anything that disputed it from any reputable sources. That said, as my collaborator Kaz pointed out to me, they may have corresponded to the Chaldean planets, though in what order is up for debate, and the only paper I could find on the subject had some seriously dubious citations, so I chose not to use it. There were also groupings of letters that were meant to be used together to represent names or phrases, but were scrambled into anagrams or written with only one of each of the letters present in the whole phrase rather than spelling out all of the words. This both disguised the writing and created a visual shorthand that made inscribing longer and more complex phrases on tiny surfaces a lot easier. Some symbols on amulets belong to no alphabet and likely signified names or phrases now sometimes unknown to us. They were called phylakteries, so some classicists use the term characters to describe these symbols. Some derive from hieroglyphs, but most resemble nothing else we've seen, and some are addressed like they're living beings in other inscriptions in the PGM and on amulets themselves. It's important to note that many different gods from many traditions had inscriptions on amulets dedicated to them, from Judeo-Christian entity names to Egyptian to Mesopotamian to Greek to Roman. Just because someone used an amulet with the name of a particular deity doesn't mean they specifically worship that deity themselves. Syncretism ran rampant, and sometimes folks who purchased these items had no clue what the meaning behind the symbols or names actually even were. On top of this, many of these items were produced by religious experts, goethes, magoi, etc. See my video on necromancy for more on them. Also, religion was much more fluid and less rigidly defined than we see it in the modern day. I've said this many times and I'll say it again here, syncretism is the most pagan thing there is. So, how did these objects go from being ordinary inert materials to amulets imbued with magical power? For some amulets, the carving of the symbolism and inscriptions, which could take many hours for the more complex phrases and imagery, could be seen itself as an act of consecration and empowerment. However, the PGM details some further ceremonies needed to activate the latent magic of the materials and inscriptions, containing the full gamut of Greek worship acts. Sacrifice, libation, sensing, recitation of magical formulae or prayers, all done while purified, sometimes in a specific place or at a set time. Some of these may have had their roots in syncretic beliefs with Egyptian practices, such as the opening of the mouth ceremony to bring a god to a statue and awaken that statue so that it might be kept alive and fed with offerings to said god. Not every component I've discussed here will be a part of every magical remedy for health or protection, but for amulets and phylacteries specifically, quite often multiple will be present for us to examine, either in written evidence or on the amulets themselves. Some may be very, very difficult to reproduce in the modern day, just as the tiny inscriptions on gemstones set into rings and pendants, or some of the stranger offerings like bad eyes or dove fat. But they may provide a baseline theory for developing modern magical practices more suited to modern lifestyles, and in fact, the PGM and Theurgic Neoplatonist texts serve as much of the theoretical DNA for modern occult practices. With that, Part 2. Healing Spells and Amulets. In case you came in midway through or just skipped this section, this is a reminder that merely talking about healing spells and amulets does not mean I'm in any way endorsing them as an alternative to medical care. If you need medical care, go to the doctor. Magic and prayer augment and complement medical treatment. They don't replace it. Also, don't put any substance into or onto your body until you've both researched it to make sure it's not going to burn your skin or poison you, and talk to your doctor about how it may interact with medications you're taking or whether or not it's toxic. There's a lot of misinformation online. Google is not the source of PhDs. People used to drop lead into wells in ancient times. We know a lot more now than they did then. Got it? As mentioned in part 1, there isn't much apparent difference between the Hippocratic school, at least in the early days, and the magic practiced by the ancient sorcerers. At least on the surface. I feel like every other sentence in this video is laden with caveats, though that's for good reason. Magic is a touchy and complicated subject, as are most things when discussing the classics. Anyway, both magic and ancient medicine often included prayers and incantations, pharmakeia, or healing concoctions of some kind, bandaging or surgery if necessary, and sometimes dietary changes. Remember, for most ancient Greeks, there was no part of life that was entirely separate from the gods. Even love and lust were seen as a sort of madness inflicted by the gods. Sorcerers might add a purification regiment and an object or set of objects, or may have the ill or injured person perform a ceremony at a certain time using certain objects and formulations. The main difference we can easily easily identify between the early Hippocratic treatment and magical treatment involves the claimed efficacy and the institutional context. The doctors tended to be a bit more honest about what they did that might not help, where spells and charms promised a higher than average efficacy due to the intervention of the gods or the specific properties imbued into the material by the magical formulae and incantations. When discussing healing magic, another important aspect to consider was the belief that many of the ingredients had pharmacological or magical properties that could only be activated by the recitation of a charm. Faraone in Magika Hiera cites Plato's Charmides as one of the earliest examples of references to this regarding a headache charm. So I told him that the thing itself was a certain leaf, but there was a charm to go with the remedy. If one uttered the charm at the moment of application, the remedy made one perfectly well, but without the charm, there was no efficacy in the leaf. Head on applied directly to the... Okay, probably not the same thing. In the PGM 7, we get an example of a spell without a physical charm attached for dealing with a migraine. Take oil on your hands and utter the spell. Zeus sowed a grape seed, it parts the soil, he does not sow it, it does not sprout. So it's clear that in some instances, the act of simply speaking an incantation could be itself as a magical act in ancient times, in addition to activating the latent magic in ingredients potentially with divine assistance. We see similar ideas in Lucian's Phylopseudes, when Tychiades and Philocles discuss healing charms and amulets in chapters 7 through 11. When the question is raised as to how an external application of something like a salve could solve an internal problem, it's reiterated that the charm itself appeals to the power of the gods, along with sacred ingredients and sacred names. We're told two stories shortly after, one in which a Chaldean manages to banish a snake venom from a young man's body on the brink of death using an incantation and a piece of a grave monument from a virgin, and one where he uses the 7 divine names after purifying with sulfur fumigation and circling the ground 3 times with a torch, which then drives out all the reptiles from an estate, and even gets the oldest and largest snake to eat the rest for good measure. Now, these stories are used in a piece titled The Liars, but they do give us an idea of what typical folk beliefs and folk magic might have looked like, as well as how fanciful sounding the claims of efficacy were to modern ears at least. Ancient Greek magic often employs the idea of like attracts like, which witchy or occult folks in the audience might recognize as sympathetic magic. For example, in the Philina Papyrus, also known as PGM 20, we see 2 very direct examples of this sort of magic and healing. The first is called an incantation of the Syrian woman from Gadara and is meant to treat inflammation. The most majestic goddess's child was set aflame as an initiate, and on the highest mountain peak was set aflame, and fire did greedily gulp 7 springs of wolves, 7 of bears, 7 of lions, but the 7 dark-eyed maidens with dark urns drew water and becalmed the restless fire. This term appears to invoke a comparison between this mythological initiation and inflammation, calling for the inflammation to be put out as the flames were put out on the initiate. There's a second fragmented inscription that references Artemis Ephesia banishing a headache for the mermaid Antara, and a third uses a flea formula. Flea headache, lion flees beneath a rock, wolves flee, horses flee on uncloven hoof, and speed beneath blows of my perfect charm. Wolves and lions were often referenced in spells as stand-ins for Gakodaimons, or malevolent spirits. See my video on ancient Greek ghosts for more on them. Pliny gives us a similar incantation to the first, except with an action attached. A fasting, naked woman is to touch a patient's back and say, Apollon, tell us that a plague cannot grow more fiery in a patient if a naked maiden quench the fire. Amulets were often created to either cause, assist with, or encourage healing from a number of maladies. In the Kyranides letter 7 of book 1, we're told, engrave a vulture on an amber stone and put a little frankincense underneath the wingtip of the bird and wear it, for it will help against dim-sightedness and cataract of the eyes. This doesn't come accompanied by any prescriptive ceremonies, prayers, or offerings, so it may be safe to assume that the protective and purificatory properties of the stones, the activating property of the symbolism of the vulture carving, and the act of wearing them close were all that were needed in the author's mind to activate the magic. PGM 33, a papyrus amulet originating from Tebtunis in Egypt in the 4th century CE or so, makes extensive use of invocation and repeated language, as well as the pattern mentioned earlier of the inverted triangle-shaped nonsense word formulae. I'm not going to begin to try to pronounce it, nor do I think it was meant to be pronounced, but I will read off the incantation that's below it. O tireless one, cook coor cool, save Thais whom Tares bore from every shivering fit, whether tertian or quartian or quotidian fever, or every other day fever, or one by night, or even a mild fever, because I am the ancestral tireless god, cook cook cool, immediately, quickly. Radcliffe Emmons III, in Drawing Down the Moon, speculates that JACandQuill may be a secret name of Heracles because it's found often around imagery of Heracles conquering the Nemean lion, showing that the Greek hero may have had healing aspects, at least in magical systems. The fever types listed here correspond to how fevers were classified by Hippocratic doctors at the time, based on the timing of the recurrence. Remember, germ theory wasn't a thing back then. We don't know what ceremony would have accompanied an amulet like this, but it likely would have been carried in an amulet case by the intended wearer. Long lists were often employed in magical formulae for both their lulling qualities, in the sense of speaking them can help induce a meditative state, and likely for thoroughness. If you don't specify exactly what you want after all, you could get anything. And if you get the type of thing you're asking for wrong, you won't get your help that you need. Edmonds III mentions another amulet made of agate found near Gorgrippa. The inscription, as he describes it, is a plea for knowledge for healing, and health for various parts of the head. Brain, ears, eardrum, uvula, throat, forehead, nostril, polyp, teeth, mouth. He mentions that the list moves from the general to the specific and, like the last, corresponds to lists of the parts of the head in a Hippocratic medical treatise, showing that the doctor shared similar views about how the body was organized to the doctors of the day. He notes that each part of the list also has a magical name or symbol inscribed next to it, which might have been part of magic protect or heal that part, or it may have been protective of the whole head, or if it's a reference to invoke power associated with any of these parts. He's not sure, but this is the struggle with interpreting ancient inscriptions without full context from the inscribers. Hermetic ideas about medicine continue the pattern of merging the divine with the seemingly mundane, discussing the affiliation of the planets with various herbs and claiming belief in the divine behind the herbs increases their efficacy, while combining older folk remedies with newer ideas around astrology. Faraone in Magika Hiera states that this is epitomized in Thessalus' power of herbs, in an entry on chicory. He states that chicory is a heliotrope, meaning that the plant's reach is for the light, and tells us that its juices, when mixed with rose oil, become an ointment that's good for getting rid of heartburn and treating certain kinds of fevers. In the same breath that Thessalus give us these seeming pharmacological remedies, he also states that, quote, if someone looking toward the sunrise smears the juice of the chicory, invoking the presence of the god Helios, he will be most favored among all men on that day. Sometimes amulets for preventing diseases were very simple. Numerous amulets with images carved of a reaper in a field have been found dating all the way back to the classical era and earlier. Sciatica is a disfigurement of the spine that is very common among field reapers, so the image was likely thought to imbue the stones with these amulets that were carved on with protective properties against spinal degradation. At the heart of all these ideas about healing, and seemingly contrary to some later ideas from the Hippocratic school, is the prospect that any malady that cannot be easily and immediately explained may have a supernatural origin and require some level of supernatural assistance to allay, or at least at the minimum, a healthy person may need protection from supernatural affliction. In the modern day, we have a much more well-developed theory, and hypotheses regarding the origins of disease and treatments are far more likely to be successful. But what I think we can take away at the minimum from any of these folk remedies, amulets, spells, etc. on the healing side is that the gods are deeply involved in all aspects of life and can be called upon alongside modern treatments for assistance when the going gets tough. While we're on the topic of threats and protection, though, Part 3, Phylakteries, Protective Magic, and Spells. As mentioned before, the ancient world was a terrifying place. We've covered how folks protected themselves from and attempted to treat disease with magical remedies, but that wasn't the only threat that presented itself to the ancient Greeks' daily life. Think about how terrifying a sea voyage is even today, for example. The waves are unpredictable even with the advances of modern science, and the ocean floor is littered with the broken bodies of ships smashed by the weather or, in the case of some unlucky yacht owners, capsized by salty orcas. Imagine how much worse it would be in ancient times without modern weather prediction technology to rely on before embarking. Protective amulets for sea travel were very common for this reason, particularly rings. The Orphic Lithica Keragamata gives us instructions on how to create an emerald ring to call upon Poseidon for protection out in the waves. On this purified stone is engraved Poseidon holding up a dolphin with a prow under his right foot and a trident in his right hand. Thereby, having hallowed it, keep hold of it, wearing it as a ring, and it will do all things that an emerald does. And it also saves those venturing through the sea from a rough wave. How about protecting a soldier all the way out in the fringes of an empire? Another individual protective amulet from North Wales reads, I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce all those names. Being a being, living excellently, not going to pronounce those either. With magic signs that recorded names, protect me, Alphianus. This is a gold amulet with Hebrew invocations and Egyptian gods inscribed with Greek characters for a Roman soldier on the border with Britannia. as put by Edmonds III in Drawing Down the Mood. Syncretism really is the most pagan thing that there is, but also any of the gods who might listen in a magical working clearly would be called on in such dire circumstances. On the topic of property related apotropaic items, some amulets that have survived were clearly found somewhere on the property to protect the harvest. A farmer could work his field all year right up until the harvest and have a hailstorm just wreck his crop at the last moment, leading to terrible damage to his livelihood and potentially the inability to store up enough to get his family through the winter in one piece. For this reason, not all amulets were carried on someone's person. 2 amulets found with inscriptions to protect a vineyard were likely affixed to poles on the boundaries of the property to protect from this very calamity. Thosuderkyo vineyard umixonte, divert from this property all hail and snow, whatever might injure the land. The god Wamotua orders it, and you, Abrasax, assist. Ie Ial. On the other side of the inscriptions, the owner of the vineyard, Julius Provincus, had his name inscribed. Interestingly, Edmonds points out in Drawing Down the Moon that even though the Romans later outlawed most form of magic, this sort of protective magic for a farm or vineyard explicitly was exempted. Again, being an ancient Greek was terrifying. One bad storm, 1 year where the weather promoted insects breeding more than usual, no more crop in an agrarian economy. Some protective amulets were also likely buried at a property or could have been carried by a general as they had inscriptions to protect groups of people during battle or in court. Edmonds mentions a gold amulet from the 2nd century CE, inscribed to protect a group of people from losses likely in court. He speculates that it was buried somewhere on the property, seemingly the opposite of the curse tablets, which were buried, dropped, or hidden closer to the target and further from the creator. But what about some of the more perishable amulets? Squill was used as a protective averter when planted in front of houses according to Theophrastus. As a note, Theophrastus in his Enquiry into Plants presides a sort of middle ground between the doubtful Hippocratic school and the magicians, often documenting folks' beliefs without actively endorsing them while also trying to reason out where some of the beliefs might have originated. Now, all bulbous plants are tenacious of life, but especially squill. For this even lives when hung up and continues to do so for a very long time. It is even able to keep other things that are stored, for instance the pomegranate. If the stalk of the fruit is set in it, and some cuttings strike more quickly if set in it, and it is said that if planted before the entrance of the door of a house, it wards off mischief which threatens it. All these bulbs grow in masses, as do onions or garlic, for they make offsets with the root, and some plainly are also increased by seed, as the asphodel, polyanthus, narcissus, cornflag, and purse tassels. But however, it is said to be a peculiarity of purse tassels that all the seeds do not germinate at once, but some in the same year, some in the next year, like an account is given of aegilops or trefoil. If this is true, it is not particular to this plant, nor perhaps is the following characteristic, which is not found in many plants that is marvelous wherever it does occur, and it is found in squill and narcissus. Namely, that whereas in most plants, whether those originally planted or those which are produced from them in season, the leaf comes up first and then presently the stem, in these plants the stem comes up first. Basically, due to the order in which these plants tend to grow and their hardiness, he thinks those factors contributed to their reputations as averters. Faraone and Obbink note in Magika Hiera that the squill was thought to have a number of both magical and pharmacological properties in ancient times, including being used as a fever reducer, cough suppressant, and a host of ritual uses. Theophrastus's Enquiry into Plants is a very good source if you want to look into some ancient folk beliefs regarding plants and magical use, as is the PGM if you know where to look. Physical threats weren't the only concerns of ancient peoples, however. Numerous protective amulets against harmful magic have also been found, likely due to the sheer ubiquity of ancient curse tablets. One public well on the edge of the Karmakos necropolis in Athens had 30 curse tablets at the bottom. Those are lead tablets, by the way. Rip that well and anybody who drank from it. So, needless to say, there was good reason to protect yourself against curses, especially if you're about to go into court or participating in a competition. Numerous protective amulets have been found to counter competition or court cases. A selection of them are discussed in both Drawing Down the Moon and Magika Hiera, both of which are at a reasonable price on Amazon at the time of recording. Heck, sometimes you need a protective amulet just for performing other spells. A rite in the PGM 36 states, "Do not therefore perform the rite rashly and do not perform it unless some dire necessity arises for you. It also possesses a protective charm against your failing, for the goddess is accustomed to make airborne those who perform this rite unprotected by a charm and hurl them from aloft down to the ground. So consequently, I've thought it necessary to take the precaution of a protective charm so that you may perform the rite without hesitation. Keep it secret. Take a hieratic papyrus and wear it around your right arm with which you make the offering, and these are the things written on it. See them on the screen, I'm not pronouncing them. Guard me from every daimon, whether an evil male or female. Keep it secret, son." So, to recap, the goddess is being called on for a spell, which calls for the target to be punished for slandering her, by the way, and they'll chuck the magician across the room without an amulet. Basically, the spell is meant to piss the goddess off. She's thought to be associated with Hecate and or Ereshkigal, so dangerous to anger, in other words. The amulet is meant to redirect the force of her rage at the target and away from the magician, because you really don't want to be the target of Agos. Her punishment was thought to be a form of possession, eros, or erotic lust so painful that the target feels as though they're practically dying without the crotch rocket of the object of desire. Yeesh, I never said the spell was ethical. Anyway, I hope my exploration of some example spell formulae and sources here will help you with your own future research on ancient magic of this sort. This isn't meant to be comprehensive, more a look at ancient spell formulae and how magicians looking to connect with the gods in this way can examine them to determine how modern spells might look. Magic, like all things in religion, evolves and changes with the needs of the people using it, but the core principles that ground it likely will stay the same. Whether you use magic or are just curious about the lengths the ancients went to get an edge, thank you so much for sticking through that. If you're new here, find the subscribe button to a post and burn the fat of the like under the full moon to banish your fever. Drop down into the comments and let me know what you found interesting, whether you'd like me to look at other subtopics in ancient magic like this, and if you found the examples I gave useful for starting your own studies. Special thanks also to Kaz for checking over my work and suggesting additional resources, as well as the amazing interview he did on the topic of magic. Check that out in the iCard if you missed it. Special thanks also to my patrons. You all waited patiently for this one while my work was slowed down due to pain constraining the hours that I can work. I can't afford to do these sorts of deep dives without your support. May the cycle of reciprocity between us ever remain positive. And remember, we're stronger together.